Welcome to the conference. Please enter the conference number. Then
Alright, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a few announcements here. Don't forget we have the free Dwell app to listen to the Bible on your phone. You can also get our digital bulletin each week by having a Faith Life account, faithlife.com/FBC-Simsboro/bulletins. It's free to join, and we want everybody to join and be a part of it. If you're going to give your offering and tithes, you can drop them off at the office. You can mail them on 33 Tiger Drive, Simsboro, Louisiana, 71275. You can also go through your bank by bill pay. You can also give through PayPal by sending money to friends and family, and our address is office at fbcsimsboro.org. You can give through the website, fbcsimsboro.org/giving, or you can text by simply texting the word give with the amount to 318-228-1499. Example, give 100. Again, this is the app for Faith Life, where you can keep up with the information that we have with our church. We have been switching over to Faith Life in order to do our church membership information and things like that. So we really want everybody to be involved and to join our FBC Simsboro group on Faith Life. It's free. Just point your camera at the screen and click the link, and it'll take you right to download the app. Also, we want to let you know Sunday, there we go. Sunday, we're going to try another way of worship service. We will do Facebook Live, we'll do YouTube, we'll do the conference call, and then we also are going to try doing drive-up church this Sunday, 10:30. You can come to the parking lot in your vehicle. Please remain in your vehicle and tune your radio to 90.1 FM. And that will give you the information. You can hear the service is broadcasted over 90.1 FM. All right, so we've been looking at and talking about our Old Testament challenge and looking through and going through the Old Testament. We're going to go through today Exodus chapter 1 through 12. You see that they're listed there at the beginning. And as we do so, hey, Curtis and Linda, y'all are watching on Facebook Live. Glad to see you. Had somebody on YouTube and they disappeared, so hey, but you can leave a comment, and that way we know that you're here watching us. And of course, this all records, so you can watch it later, which I'm sure is what everybody is going to be doing, right? So anyway, here we go. So we've talked about before about how in the last week particularly, about how God made a covenant with Israel, with Abraham, and making he will have a son Isaac, and they will be a people. God says that they will be a people unto themselves, and that they will also have a place in Canaan, and he gave them a place in which to move to and to be able to go to. And so we are kind of reviewing that here. God had called Abram and his family to leave, and so they ended up in the area of Canaan. And then we also saw last week about how they had Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and all that took place with them. And then we also saw last week about how Jacob, Jacob had his sons, and Joseph, one of his sons, coat of many colors. His brothers got angry and with him because they just kind of saw him as a daddy's boy, and they also saw him as somebody who was kind of ratting them out when they didn't do right. And so they went on from there, and as they went, they pretended that their brother Joseph had been killed, and instead they sold him into slavery. He then was bought out of slavery, or bought from slavery by Potiphar, and he was put in charge of managing Potiphar's household. Everything was going very well until Potiphar's wife decided to look and try to seduce him. And so when that didn't work, he was framed. Potiphar's wife made an accusation against him that he had tried to attack her, and so they then threw him in jail. While he was there, the Pharaoh had dreams. Joseph was the one who was able to interpret the dream. Pharaoh then put Joseph in charge of the collection and the distribution of food, because part of the dream was God saying that a famine was coming. And then Joseph's family, experiencing the famine, came to him, and they were reunited. So that's kind of where we ended last time, through the book of Genesis. This next section we're going to be looking at from there about the people of Israel, particularly in the first part of the book of Exodus. Again, we're not going verse by verse. We're just kind of doing an overview of these passages, and encourage you to read them on your own as you're able to. Here's kind of the idea of where God had called his people. You notice the area there called the Fertile Crescent. This is an area that was produced a good bit of crops, and you notice that Canaan is a large part of that. There's a large part of that from Canaan there, and God here had called them and called his people, the Israelites, to go to this area, knowing that they would be taken care of, knowing that they would prosper, because this was a fertile area. He put them also around in this area, but they were in the midst of enemies. You see the enemies listed there that were enemies of Israel, the people of Israel, and the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. And you see that even though they were in this place of a fertile area where they could grow and prosper, yet they were still in the midst of their enemies. And sometimes we kind of get this idea that when we follow God, everything is easy. There's no hardships. There's no struggling. But yet God here placed them amongst his enemies, their enemies, but he protected them in the midst of it. Because he wanted the Israelites to be reminded of the fact that they were dependent not upon themselves, but on God to take care of them. And the rest of the Old Testament, we see Israel constantly forgetting this and making either fighting against their enemies and losing because of their sinfulness, because they've turned away from God, and God allows these enemies to take them over. Or in some cases they make treaties with these enemies to try to appease the enemies, and those don't work out well either. So what's happening to those Israelites? What's taking place here as we look in the beginning of Exodus chapter 1? The first thing we see is that God begins to bless, as God has been blessing them, and suddenly then they begin to have oppression that takes place. Now, we see in Exodus chapter 1, it says Joseph and all of his brothers and all that generation eventually died. So they were being very prosperous as Joseph was in charge. Life was good, and then it says Joseph died. And then it says, but the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. and a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So here, God has been blessing them. They have been doing well. And now, though, there's a new king. The Pharaoh who knew the people, who protected the people, has died. The new king has come into power in Egypt. Then we also see it says, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. So this is the Pharaoh talking to the Egyptians. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So in other words, what the Pharaoh is saying here is that he says, hey, Egypt, these Israelites are a threat to us. They're a threat to us because of how well they're doing, how prosperous they're doing, how the numbers of people that they have that are in their population. And so we're worried about them. We're concerned about them. So what we're going to do is we're going to then act shrewdly, deal shrewdly with them. And in other words, we're going to put them into slavery. It didn't happen immediately. It began slowly, but eventually they were put into slavery and began to experience the slavery that we see coming up here in a little bit. It says that, so the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. So the Egyptians put them to work building these supply cities here. And it says, but the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So again, even as they're under this oppression, God is continuing to take care of them. He's continuing to bless them. He's continuing to see them grow in numbers. And the verse 13 says, they worked the Israelites ruthlessly. Verse 14, and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all of this work on them. So this was a means of punishment. They saw them as a threat, and so because they saw them as a threat, they worked them, hoping to eventually get them to decrease in number and to not be a threat to them. Sometimes it's interesting because sometimes we will actually look at and see something as a threat when it's really not. The Israelites, God hadn't promised the Israelites that they were going to have a promised land in Egypt. He said it was going to be in Canaan. But yet the Egyptians saw the Israelites as a threat, and so they treated them as such. And not everything that we see as a threat is actually a threat. The question becomes really for us is, are we seeking the Lord about when hardships and troubles and things come? Do we look to Him for His guidance and His protection? All right, so as you see this, the Israelites are feeling very much powerless. Have you ever felt that way? Think about that for just a second. Have you ever felt powerless? Maybe you feel powerless now. Maybe it's to something related to something going on in your life. Maybe you feel powerless right now because of all this social distancing and the coronavirus. And maybe that's what you feel powerless about. Or maybe you feel powerless or oppressed by losing your job and having mortgage to pay for and bills to pay for, and you feel powerless for that. Maybe you feel powerless because of a circumstance going on within your family. Or maybe you're feeling powerless in some other way. Where do you feel powerless right now? And ask God for His presence, His power, and His protection. See, when we feel powerless, we oftentimes turn to ourselves and look to ourselves to try to solve the problem. We try to look toward our own abilities to be able to solve the problem. But really what we see here is that God, throughout the life of Israel, is not only providing His power, His protection, but also His presence with them. And so one of the points of the lesson today is to remind ourselves that we can trust God for everything. Do we really trust God even when things don't make sense? Do we really trust God when things aren't going our way? when we feel powerless. Trust, it's easy to say we trust God in those circumstances, but the only way to truly trust God is to trust Him and to put that into action. So we also see that what's taking place now is faith instead of fear. So here they are, Israel is powerless, they're oppressed, and what's taking place now is that the Pharaoh has said, okay, we got to do something about this. We got to do something about these folks, these Israelites and their numbers. So it says the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the first whose name was Sapphira and the second whose name was Puah, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver, and if the child is a son, kill him, but if it's a daughter, she may live. So the Egyptian, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, decides, well, what we're doing is not working, so we need to do some population control. So he gets these two midwives and says to them, hey, look, here's what I want you to do. When a Hebrew woman gives birth, I want you to kill, if it's a son, I want you to kill him. I want you to eliminate all the males so that they are no longer, can't continue to populate, and what we'll do is we will wipe out this whole group of people. We'll, in a sense, what he's saying is we're going to commit genocide to the people. We're going to make sure that they are not a threat to us by simply eliminating them, if you will. It's interesting that he goes to these two midwives, because one of the things we see is what their response is. It says, the midwives, however, feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, and they let the boys live. So here the boys, the midwives here stood against the power of the Egyptian king, of the Pharaoh, and instead said, we fear God more than we fear man, and we're not going to do this. We're not going to commit genocide in the name of these, in the name of the Pharaoh. Rather, we're going to worship the Lord. We're going to serve the Lord. It's interesting, if you think about these folks, most of us have never heard of these midwives before. You've probably read this passage of Scripture here and seen the names, but you probably have never really even remembered them. When we were in seminary, actually, we were doing a class with Dr. Potts, who did Old Testament survey, and we had to read like the book of Genesis and Exodus the first week. And so before we came back to class for the second week, and he would always have these pop tests as we would begin to start the class. And one of the first questions of the pop test for the first week was name the midwives. And every one of us at the seminary class got it wrong. I don't know that any of us got it right. I don't remember anybody getting it right. And the reason I mention that is because, really we think about these two women. They're mentioned here in Scripture, but they were just normal, everyday people. They were people who most of us would probably forget about. But yet God used these everyday people to do His work. Sometimes we think that, well, I can't serve God, I can't take a stand for God, I can't do something in a way that serves Him because I'm I'm a nobody. Well, these two midwives would have probably said the same thing about themselves, but rather instead they decided and they chose to instead trust God, and so they let the boys live. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said this. He said, all that I see teaches me to trust the Creator for all I have not seen. All I have seen teaches me to trust the Creator for all that I have not seen. Part of trust, it's easy to trust someone or something when we can see it, when we know it, when we have experience with it. But yet, what Emerson is reminding us of is the same thing that we see here in Scripture, is the fact that trusting God, we trust God because although we may not be able to see, He sees everything. Nothing has ever surprised God. Nothing has ever snuck up on God. God sees all. He knows all because He's God. And because of that, we can trust Him, even when we don't trust ourselves or the circumstances. Well then, so out of that we see in chapter 2 verses 1 through 10 where Moses is then born. We know that Pharaoh says, okay, this isn't working. He asks these midwives, okay, what's going on? And basically what they said to him was, well, you know, these women are having these children so fast we can't even get there. By the time we get there, they're already born. There's nothing we can do about it. And so Pharaoh then decides, okay, here's what we're going to do. He said he's going to issue a decree, and all male boys that are born, their wives are to take them, or their mothers rather, are to take them and throw them into the Nile River, all the male boys. And we see in chapter 2 that Moses' mother, though, says she can't do that. And so instead she builds a little basket for him and she places him in the Nile. And as she does so, or because as she has done that, suddenly the Pharaoh's daughter shows up to bathe with her attendants. And suddenly they hear this baby crying. And Moses' mother had placed him in this basket in the river to hide him. But here she finds him and she adopts him. And she raises Moses as her own. But then we see that as years later, verse 11 says, years later after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people, and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. See, Moses here is torn between two worlds. Here he was raised as an Egyptian in the household of Pharaoh. His adopted mother was the daughter of Pharaoh. He got to experience all of the good things of being raised under Pharaoh's roof. But he also knew that he was a Hebrew because his sister had become a nursemaid to him and had helped raise him. And so because of that, he knew of his background. He knew where he came from. And it says years later, as he was older, as he was in his young adulthood, he saw an Egyptian taskmaster striking a Hebrew. So it says here, looking around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. You know, it's interesting. Moses, it says here that he looked around. Moses looked around to see, and seeing no one, he then killed the Egyptian. One of the things that we see here, when he says here looking around, it's interesting that what Moses did not look to. Moses looked around, didn't see anybody that could rat on him, didn't see anybody that could say that, look what Moses did. And so he just said, hey, look, I got this opportunity here. The coast is clear. I'm just going to go ahead and vindicate my people. But what is interesting about this, if we think about it, is where was Moses not looking? Moses wasn't looking to the Lord. Moses didn't look up to God and seek heavenly counsel or wisdom. Rather, instead, he just relied on his upbringing. He relied on himself. And because of that, we see the Egyptian was killed. When Pharaoh had heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. So Moses now has to run. He has to leave the area because Pharaoh has heard about it. And in fact, a few verses before this, Moses is confronted by an Israelite. And as they're arguing, some Israelites are fighting amongst themselves, they're arguing, and Moses tries to intervene, and one of them says, were you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And here Moses thought nobody knew about it. But obviously they did. The Israelites knew about it, and Pharaoh knew about it, and so Moses fled. He left and went to Midian, and he sat down by a well, the Bible says here. And then as he's in Midian, he meets Jethro, and he ends up marrying Jethro, his daughter. No, he didn't marry Jethro. He married Jethro's daughter. One of his daughters, Jethro, became his father-in-law. And it says, after a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew Let's see. Oops, I think I skipped one here. Or did it stop right there? God knew. Oops, let's see. I'm going way in the wrong direction. Let's see here. And God knew. That's where it stopped. And God knew. And so what we see here is taking place is that the Israelites have continuing to get worse. Their treatment is continuing to be worse. And because of that, they're crying out to God. Oftentimes, when is it that we cry out to God the most? We cry out to God the most when we're distressed, when we're under difficulty, when we're being oppressed. We cry out to God and say, God, help me, God, help me. When things are going good, we tend to forget about God. We tend to not involve or not be around God. We tend to think, wow, look at all that I'm doing. Look how good things are. But Israel here, like so many of us, groaned. They cried out to the Lord, and says God heard them, and He remembered His covenant. Now, the English language is not great. Is not a great language in the sense that we have certain words that do not translate very well from other languages. We use the example of love as oftentimes for this. In Greek, there are 4 words for love: agape, phileo, eros, storge, and so. But in English, we just have love. So I can love my wife, I can love my friend, I can love a hot dog. But yet the reality is all 3 of those better be different types of love, and they are. In Greek, like I said, there are 4 words. Those 4 words encompasses different types of types of love. In our English, we just have love. Well, here is the same situation with the word remembered. And God remembered His covenant. That doesn't mean God forgot about it, or God had just somehow forgotten that He had this covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. No, it means that He wasn't that he forgot, but rather He renewed. He said, okay, I'm going to do this. This is part of my covenant. I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to continue to take care of my people, the Israelites. And so we see now in chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, that Moses here is out tending to his sheep as all this is going on, the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. And he's out being a good shepherd and being a good son-in-law. And the Bible tells us in verse 3 of chapter 3 that Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burning up. So chapter 3 is the burning bush experience with Moses. God here takes a bush and the bush catches fire, but it's not burned up. It's on fire, but it's not burned up. And it escapes Moses' attention. And here, notice he says here, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. If we were to translate this into our modern redneck vernacular, Moses would be saying, wow, look at this. Man, what's going on here? Man, I got to see what's happening here. Something's going on here. I got to see what's taking place. And so Moses here goes to the bush, and as he goes to the bush, God says to him, you're on holy ground. Take your shoes off because I want to meet with you, because I'm calling you to do something. I'm calling you to leave being this shepherd, and instead I want you to lead my people here. Moses had 5 objections, and as you can see, the 5th one there, we'll get to that in a minute, but in chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, Moses asked the question, well, who am I to do this? God, why are you wanting me to do this? Who am I to be a part of this? Why would you want me to do this? Or why would you call me? I'm nobody special. I don't understand why you would want me to do this, or why you would be calling me to do this, because I'm nobody. I'm not somebody that can do this. Who do you? In other words, he says basically to God, who do you think I am? And we see that then as he looks at this, as he says this, his response that we see here in verse 11 and 12, he said, why should I even go to Pharaoh? Who am I to do this? And God's answer God answers him and says, I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I am the one who sent you. You will bring the people out of Egypt. You will all worship God at this mountain. And so, sometimes we may get this same mindset. God, why are you calling me to do this? What type of, why would you do that? Who am I to do this? Someone once said years ago, and it's always stuck with me, that God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And what that means is that if God's calling you to do something, He provides the means and everything that you need to be able to do the task. God doesn't call you to do something and just says, well, good luck, you're on your own. And Moses had to learn this truth here. Second objection he had is then he said, well, not only who am I, but who are you? Who are you what am I supposed to say to folks? Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your ancestors sent me, and they ask me, what's his name? What should I tell them? And God replied in verse 14, I am who I am. I am sent you. It's interesting. God says to Moses, God gives Moses his name. God's name is I am. God is the one who is able to do everything. Why? Because he's God. God can deliver them. Why? Because he's God. God can provide for them, as we'll see later, as they're in the wilderness. Why? Because he is God. God is enough. I am. He didn't say I was, I will be. He says I am. I am enough. I am the one who's calling. I am the one who's here going to lead my people. And then the third objection he had is, what if they don't listen to me? What if they don't listen? In chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, we see that Moses' next objection is, these folks ain't going to listen to me. What if they won't believe me and will not obey me, but say the Lord did not appear to you? And so what God says to him is, okay, what do you have in your hand? What's that in your hand? And Moses says, well, it's a staff. And so he says, throw it on the ground. And Moses throws it to the ground, and it becomes a snake. And Moses ran from it. Now, I can understand completely that right there. If I had a stick or a staff and I threw it on the ground and it became a snake, I'm out of here, folks. I'm going to run. I was going to say, whoa, what's going on here? But then God says, Moses, stretch out your hand, grab it by the tail. And so he stretched out his hand and he caught it, and it became a staff again. Now, again, I'm not a big snake person, but I know one thing. If I got to catch a snake, I ain't grabbing it by the tail, because it can whip around and get you again. But what we see here is God is saying here, I'm going to not only deliver them, but if they won't listen, then they will see my work and what I'm doing through you. They will see the action that has taken place. When we serve God, we may say, who am I, God, that you would want me to do this? I'm not qualified to do it. God, what if people don't listen to me? God says, I will work through you. And people will, if they don't listen with their ears, they will see me working through their eyes. So let me work. The next objection that he had is number 4, which is I'm not capable. I'm not capable. And what he says here is, as he talks about I'm not capable, in chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, Moses replied to God and says, Lord, I've never been eloquent, either in the past or recent, or since you have been speaking to your servant, because my mouth and my tongue are sluggish. And the Lord said to him, who placed a mouth into humans? Who makes a person mute or deaf, seeing or blind? If it is not I, the Lord, is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. Moses says here, not only who am I to say this, I'm nobody, but I don't have these abilities. I'm not capable. I can't do this. I can't speak very well. I'm not a good speaker. God, all I do is mumble, and all I do is struggle with things to say. Lord, what am I supposed to do? I can't speak. And what God says to Moses is, Moses, I will speak through you. I will give you the words to say. I will be able to be the one who guides you and leads you and tells you what to say. All you have to do is follow me. And of course, you see the 5th objection that's been up here from the very beginning, since my PowerPoint didn't work too well. His fifth objection is, well, I don't want to. In chapter 4, verses 13, Moses says, Lord, send somebody else. Lord, I don't want to serve you. I don't want to do this. God, I'm not interested in doing this. In verse 14, it says, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. You know, God here had called Moses to serve him. God had called Moses to be able to lead his people. Today, looking back, we look at Moses looking backward from today, and we see Moses and we say, well, you know, he was a leader of Israel, and he was a great man of faith. And we think about all the things that Moses did, that God did through Moses, and as Moses, you know, came down the mountain with the 10 Commandments and part of the Red Sea, that God did all that through him. Moses here at this point says, I don't want to do it. I'm not interested. I want to stay where I am. Leave me with my sheep, my wife. Leave me where I am. I don't want to. Moses here was actually practicing idolatry, because Moses was worshiping his comfort. Moses was worshiping his current situation. He wasn't worshiping God. And that's why God's anger burned against Moses. Because God was the one who had created Moses. God was the one who had arranged all of this, had brought all this to be. And Moses' response was, I just don't want to. I'm just not interested. How often do we say that very same thing to God? How often do we say, God, I'm nobody. God, no one's going to listen to me. God, I don't have the ability. God, I just don't want to put forth the effort. Well, in chapter 5, verse 2, it says, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Moses here has gone to Pharaoh, and as he's gone to Pharaoh and brought the word of the Lord to Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, well, who are you talking about? Who is this Lord that I should obey him? I'm not going to listen to him. I'm not going to let Israel go. And so we see that in chapter 7 on, we see where God then uses some plagues to be able to get the Egyptians to release the Israelites. John Hannah in the commentary, the Bible Knowledge commentary here, actually found several interesting facts about the plagues. You see here on the left side it says the plagues, and in the center column the reference in Exodus. And then it says here, possible Egyptian god or goddesses of Egypt attacked by the plagues. So for example, in Exodus 7:14 through 21, God turns the Nile into blood. And what John Hannah has found was that by turning the Nile into blood, God was showing that the Egyptians that he was more powerful than the gods there, that the god of the Nile, which was Apis, or Happy, or Happy, Hippie, could be a hippie. Also, the goddess of the Nile, Isis. He did all of these. He showed that God showed that he truly is I am, because he was more powerful than all of these gods here that Egypt was worshiping, the little g gods. And God did these things, brought about these plagues to show the Egyptians, because just think about it, when the Nile turned to blood, what was it the Egyptians were going to do? They were going to go pray to their gods, their idols, their little g gods. And yet God was showing that he was more powerful than the made-up gods that the Egyptians were worshiping. And you see the plagues here: Nile turned to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, death of livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then of course the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn here that took place. And speaking of that, this is the beginning of something called Passover. God delivers his people here by the 10th plague by instituting or protecting Israel by instituting the Passover. Here we see in verse 5, you must have, here's God's, what God has said to his people. his instructions. He says, "You must have an unblemished animal, a year old. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats, and you are to keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses where they eat them. They are to eat the meal that night. They should eat it roasted over the fire along with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in boiling water, but only roasted over fire, its head as well as its legs and inner organs. You must not leave any of it until tomorrow. Any part of it left until morning you must burn. Here is how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn son or firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am the Lord. I will execute judgments against all of the gods, little g, of Egypt." And so God here institutes the Passover, where he says, "Okay, Israel, here's what I want you to do. Israel, I want you to get this lamb, this sheep. I want you to slaughter it. I want you to put the blood on the doorpost. I want you to eat this meal of unleavened bread and eat of the meat. I want you to be dressed and ready to go as you're eating it, because we're not just going to be eating it and sitting back and letting life just continue on, but rather instead what we're going to do is we're going to be a people who are ready for when God delivers Egypt, or rather Israel from Egypt." What's interesting is right now, we think about the Passover of God delivering. Notice what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5:7. It says, "Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." Verse John 1:29, the next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." As God here provided Israel with a Passover lamb to bring them out of the slavery of Egypt, we this week are remembering, as Holy Week, as we get ready for Easter, we're remembering that God also provided us, Jesus Christ, the perfect Lamb, to die on a cross for our sinfulness, that we could, that our sin could be passed over, the wrath of God could be passed over us because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. If you think about it, already in Genesis, the book of Genesis, we see where God has provided a lamb for when he called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He delivered a lamb. Here he calls a lamb the people of Israel to sacrifice, so for the Passover to be able to be delivered from slavery. And God gives us and has sent Jesus to die for us on a cross as the perfect lamb, that we may be delivered from sin and death. God is still in the delivering business. God is still delivering his people, delivering the world through the death of Christ. And as we think about that and as we celebrate this coming week, my prayer is that as we do so, we're reminded of what all God has done for us. God didn't have to do any of this. God didn't have to make a covenant with his people. God didn't have to go to and have the Passover here of the firstborn who's the firstborn of Egypt and the firstborn of the Jews that didn't partake of the Passover. He didn't have to do that either. God didn't have to come as a human being and live on this earth and die on a cross for our sins. God didn't have to do any of that. But he did so because God is a God of love. God's work here is a work of love that's extended to each and every one of us. My hope is that as we participate this week, as we focus this week on the time of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, that we'll be taking the time to be thankful for what God has done for us through Christ. Not because he owed us, not because he had to, but because of simply who he is. And as we close today, this evening, I just want to remind you of a few announcements here. Again, Don't forget that if you are interested, oh, there you go, all the way back to here. If you're interested, we do have, are using the Dwell app. It's free. It's something that they've offered churches for 60 days. It's a way to download the app and listen to the Bible each day. And you can do so right now by simply going to that website right there. Also, don't forget faithlife.com/Simsboro. I want you to join our group, and you can keep up with things going on, including our bulletins there. You can still continue to give your tithes through dropping them off by mail, through bank, through bill pay, through PayPal, by sending it as a friend, office at fbcsimsboro.org, through our website, fbcsimsboro.org/giving, through text, 318-228-1499, and then enter the word give in the amount. And there is the little app that you can put your phone there on your computer screen and take a picture of, and it will take you to the app for Faith Life. And then also, don't forget, this Sunday we're going to try to do Drive Up Church, 10:30. You can come. You need to stay in your car. The church will not be unlocked. Just stay in your car, tune your radio to 90.1 FM, and you can be here and enjoy worship with us that way, or through Facebook Live, or through YouTube, or through our conference call. We're glad that we've had you here today. Appreciate everybody coming in, and we will see you guys a little later.